No one expected the question. The studio lights were warm, the audience was relaxed. The conversation had been smooth, polite, almost predictable. Jonathan Roumie sat calmly on the couch, hands folded, posture relaxed. To millions around the world, he was the face of Jesus from The Chosen, a role that had changed his life and deeply moved audiences across cultures and faiths. Then suddenly, the tone shifted. Whoopi Goldberg leaned forward, looked directly at him, and said something that froze the room. "So let me ask you something honestly," she began. "You play Jesus, but do you actually believe in him?" A nervous chuckle rippled through the audience. But she didn't stop there. Because some people say actors who take religious roles secretly mock faith, some even hate what they portray. She paused. "So tell us, do you hate Jesus?" The silence that followed was unbearable. Cameras zoomed in. Producers exchanged looks. The audience stopped breathing. This wasn't a scripted moment. This was live television. Jonathan didn't blink, didn't laugh it off, didn't interrupt. For a split second, the entire world waited. Would he get angry? Would he defend himself? Would he walk out? Because this wasn't just a question. It was an accusation. An accusation aimed at a man whose career, reputation, and faith were now being challenged in front of millions without warning. Social media began to explode instantly. Clips were being recorded. Comments were flying in real time. Some viewers thought the question was unfair. Others thought it was intentional provocation. Many believed Jonathan had just been set up, and then there were those waiting for him to fail. The pressure was enormous. This was not just about acting. This was about belief, identity, integrity. Jonathan Roumie, who had spent years portraying Jesus with reverence, who had spoken openly about faith, who had inspired countless people, was now being asked to defend his heart in under 10 seconds. Whoopi sat back, arms crossed, watching him closely. The audience leaned forward. Even the band stopped moving. If Jonathan reacted emotionally, he'd look defensive. If he joked, he'd look dismissive. If he argued, he'd look combative. There was no safe answer. And yet Jonathan smiled. Not a nervous smile. Not an arrogant one. A calm, grounded smile. Like someone who wasn't afraid of the truth. He took a slow breath. And in that moment, something changed. Because instead of responding like a celebrity under attack, he responded like a man who knew exactly who he was. What he said next didn't just silence the studio. It shifted the energy of the entire room. It wasn't loud. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't rehearsed. But it carried weight. The kind of weight that makes people stop talking. The kind that makes accusations fall apart on their own. And by the time he finished his response, Whoopi Goldberg, one of the most outspoken voices on television, had no words left. No argument, no follow-up, just silence. Because sometimes the strongest answer isn't defense. It's truth spoken with calm conviction. And what Jonathan Roumie said next would be remembered long after the cameras stopped rolling. Earlier that day, the show had been business as usual. The studio buzzed with quiet efficiency. Makeup artists brushing powder, producers checking cue cards, assistants whispering countdowns. The audience filed in with coffee cups and phones tucked away, ready for another light, entertaining episode. Jonathan Roumie arrived without spectacle, no entourage, no loud greetings, just a calm presence and a polite smile. Some people recognized him immediately. Others didn't, at least not at first. But there was something about him that made people pause. Not fame, not ego, something quieter, grounded. Backstage, a junior producer leaned over to another and whispered, "That's the guy from The Chosen." "Oh," the other replied. "The Jesus guy." Jonathan heard it. He always did, and he never corrected anyone. For him, the role had never been about being the Jesus guy. It was about responsibility, about honoring something sacred without turning it into spectacle. He sat in the green room, flipping through notes he didn't really need. Not lines, not talking points, just reminders, quotes, prayers, thoughts he carried with him before interviews. He closed his eyes for a moment, not out of nerves, out of intention. Out on the main set, Whoopi Goldberg prepared for the show like she always did, confident, relaxed, commanding the room without trying. She had interviewed presidents, icons, troublemakers, and saints of every kind. Nothing rattled her, or so it seemed. The topic list for the episode was harmless enough: faith in modern entertainment, responsibility of actors portraying real figures, the cultural impact of The Chosen. No red flags, no warnings. When the cameras went live, the audience applauded, and Jonathan walked out to warm smiles and polite cheers. He waved briefly and took his seat, nodding respectfully to the hosts. The first 10 minutes were smooth. Whoopi asked about his journey as an actor. Another host asked about the pressure of playing a historical figure. Jonathan answered with humility, never grandstanding, never preaching. "I don't own the role," he said at one point. "I try to serve it." The audience nodded. Some smiled. Everything felt safe. But safety doesn't make headlines. As the conversation moved deeper into faith, the energy subtly changed. Whoopi leaned back, listening. Really listening. She had strong opinions about religion. Always had. She believed in questioning power, challenging tradition, and calling out hypocrisy wherever she saw it. And in her mind, faith, especially public faith, deserved scrutiny. Jonathan spoke about reverence. About fear, not fear of people, but fear of misrepresenting something holy. About how portraying Jesus wasn't acting for him, it was accountability. Some audience members shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't the kind of faith that shouted. It wasn't political. It wasn't aggressive. It was quiet, and that made it harder to challenge. Whoopi smiled, but her eyes narrowed slightly. She waited. Then she changed direction. She said casually, "A lot of actors take on religious roles for attention, awards, career boosts."
Jonathan nodded. "That happens."
"And sometimes," she continued, "people don't realize actors can separate themselves completely from the characters they play." The audience murmured softly. Jonathan stayed calm. "That's true too." There was a pause. A long one. The kind of pause that signals a turn. Whoopi leaned forward. "And that makes people wonder," she said, "whether portraying faith is sincere, or whether it's actually mockery in disguise." The air tightened. Jonathan looked at her, not defensively, not confused. Just attentive. She continued. "You're playing the most sacred figure in Christianity. That comes with assumptions, expectations." She smiled faintly. "So I have to ask, do you believe in what you're portraying? Or are you just playing a role you don't personally connect with?" A few audience members exchanged glances. Jonathan inhaled slowly, still calm, still respectful. He began to answer, but before he could finish, Whoopi added one more sentence. The sentence that crossed the line. "Because some people say that taking on Jesus like this is disrespectful. Even hateful." The studio froze. Jonathan stopped mid-breath. And then came the final blow, spoken softly but sharp enough to cut through everything. "So tell me honestly," she said, "do you hate Jesus?" Time slowed. This wasn't curiosity anymore. This wasn't debate. This was confrontation, live, unfiltered, impossible to undo. Jonathan now understood something very clearly. This wasn't about acting. This wasn't about television. This was a moment that could either turn into noisy or into something far more powerful. The audience waited. Millions watched, and Jonathan Roumie prepared to answer, not as an actor, but as a man. The question hung in the air like smoke. "Do you hate Jesus?" No laughter followed. No nervous clapping. Not even a cough from the audience. For the first time since the show began, the studio felt too small. Jonathan Roumie didn't answer right away. Not because he was stunned, but because he understood the moment he was standing in. This wasn't a debate he could win with words alone. This was a trap disguised as curiosity. Any rushed response would sound defensive. Any emotional response would look guilty. Across from him, Whoopi watched carefully. She wasn't shouting. She wasn't attacking loudly. That was what made it dangerous. Millions of viewers leaned closer to their screens. Social media feeds refreshed by the second. Clips were already being cut by people who sensed something big was unfolding. Jonathan rested his hands on his knees and lowered his gaze briefly, not in submission, but in grounding. He breathed in slowly, deeply. Then he looked up. His voice, when it came, was steady. "I don't think hate is something you can hide when you carry it," he said calmly. The audience stirred. Whoopi raised an eyebrow but didn't interrupt. Jonathan continued. "And I don't think you can spend years walking with someone, studying their words, their silences, their suffering if you despise them." There was a pause. Not dramatic, natural. He wasn't performing. He wasn't preaching. He was answering. "You asked if I believe in what I portray," Jonathan said, choosing each word carefully. "The truth is, this role didn't come from ambition. It came from fear." A murmur rippled through the audience. "Fear of getting it wrong," he explained. "Fear of misrepresenting something sacred. Fear of turning faith into entertainment." Whoopi leaned back slightly, arms uncrossing. Jonathan went on. "When I first read the script, I didn't think I was worthy of the role. I still don't. But I said yes because I believed the story wasn't about me. It was about service, silence, the kind that forces people to listen. But hate," he repeated softly. "No." He shook his head once. "If I hated Jesus," he said, "I wouldn't pray before stepping onto set. I wouldn't sit with his words long after the camera stopped. And I certainly wouldn't allow this role to change me the way it has. The atmosphere shifted. Some audience members nodded. Others wiped their eyes without realizing it. Whoopi opened her mouth, then closed it again. Jonathan wasn't finished. You see, he said, leaning forward just slightly, it's easy to accuse from a distance. It's harder to understand what it costs to carry a symbol that means everything to millions of people. He looked around the studio. This isn't a costume to me. It's a responsibility. For a brief moment, it felt like the confrontation had dissolved. But then Whoopi responded. I hear what you're saying, she said slowly. But you have to understand, religion has hurt a lot of people. When faith is presented publicly, it can feel threatening. Especially when it's idealized. Jonathan nodded. I agree. That answer surprised her. Yes, he continued, faith has been misused, weaponized, twisted, and people have suffered because of that. The audience leaned in even more. But Jesus, Jonathan said quietly, is not the people who used his name to harm others. The room went still again. That distinction matters. Whoopi looked at him carefully now, not challengingly but curiously. Jonathan pressed on, not louder but firmer. When someone asks me if I hate Jesus, what they're really asking is whether I'm pretending, whether this is a mask. He paused. It's not. He looked directly at Whoopi. I don't expect everyone to believe what I believe, he said respectfully, but I won't apologize for honoring it. The tension was no longer hostile. It was heavy, charged. Whoopi exhaled slowly. The audience began to clap, hesitant at first, then stronger. A producer off camera glanced at the timer, unsure whether to cut to commercial. This wasn't the segment they had planned. Jonathan's final words in that moment landed softly, but deeply. Hate is loud, he said. Faith, real faith, doesn't need to shout. Applause filled the studio, not wild, not explosive, sincere. Whoopi sat silently for several seconds. Then she nodded. The confrontation was over. But the impact had only just begun. Because what Jonathan Roumie had done in those few minutes wasn't just answer a question. He dismantled an accusation without attacking back. He replaced tension with dignity. And he showed millions of people what calm conviction looks like under pressure. And in doing so, he left the room and the world watching with something far more powerful than an argument. He left them thinking. For a moment, no one moved. The applause faded slowly, like a wave pulling back from shore. The studio lights hummed overhead. Cameras kept rolling, but the energy had changed completely. What had started as a daytime talk show now felt like something far more serious. Whoopi Goldberg sat quietly, hands resting on the table, eyes fixed on the floor for a brief second longer than usual. That silence said more than any rebuttal could have. Around the studio, audience members exchanged glances. Some nodded to each other. Others sat with hands clasped, as if unsure whether they had just witnessed a confrontation or a confession. Jonathan Roumie sat exactly where he had been the entire time. Same posture, same calm expression. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't leaned into the drama, and that was what made the moment impossible to ignore. A co-host cleared their throat and tried to lighten the mood with a half smile. Well, they said, that certainly gave us something to think about. A few nervous laughs followed, but the wait remained. Backstage, producers gestured frantically. One whispered into a headset, "Do we cut early?" Another shook their head. This moment couldn't be undone. Cutting away would only make it worse. The cameras stayed. Whoopi finally looked up. When she spoke, her voice was different, lower, measured. You know, she said slowly, I've been doing this a long time. Jonathan listened without interrupting. I've seen people use faith as a shield, she continued, and I've seen it used as a weapon. So I ask hard questions. She paused. But I don't think you're doing either of those things. The audience exhaled collectively. Jonathan inclined his head slightly. Thank you. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't relief. It was respect. The co-hosts leaned in now, sensing the shift. One asked, "Did you expect this level of scrutiny when you accepted the role?" Jonathan smiled gently. I expected more questions than answers. A soft chuckle moved through the room. But the viewers at home were already reacting. Phones buzzed across the country. Social feeds filled with clips and captions. He handled that with grace. This is how you respond under pressure. Faith without anger. Comment sections lit up, some in defense, some in reflection, others in disbelief that the moment hadn't turned explosive. Back in the studio, Whoopi nodded slowly, absorbing it all. I have to say, she admitted, that was a beautiful response. Jonathan met her gaze, not with pride but appreciation. Conversations like this matter. he said, even when they're uncomfortable. That line lingered. Because discomfort had been the point. The audience applauded again, this time without hesitation. Not because someone had won, but because something honest had happened. During the next commercial break, crew members whispered behind the scenes. That could have gone really bad, one said. Another replied, but it didn't. Jonathan remained seated during the break, sipping water quietly. A makeup artist approached to dab his forehead. She leaned in and whispered, "Thank you for how you handled that." He smiled and nodded. When the cameras came back on, the segment wrapped up gently. No more accusations, no more sharp questions. The conversation shifted to art, storytelling, and responsibility. But the moment had already escaped the studio. By the end of the hour, clips were circulating everywhere. Some headlines praised Jonathan's composure. Others debated the question itself. A few tried to turn it into controversy. But most people noticed the same thing. He hadn't fought back. He hadn't tried to dominate. He had simply stood still and spoken truth. Whoopi, for her part, addressed the moment later that day in a brief off-air comment. "Hard questions are part of my job," she said, "but honest answers deserve respect." It wasn't an apology, but it was acknowledgement. And sometimes that's louder. Jonathan left the studio the same way he had entered. No victory lap, no interviews in the hallway, no celebration. Just a man walking out, having said what he needed to say. Outside, a few fans waited. One called out,
We saw that. Thank you.
Jonathan waved once, then disappeared into the afternoon crowd. That day, something unexpected happened. A confrontation meant to provoke had turned into a moment of reflection. A question meant to corner had opened a conversation, and a potential conflict had become a lesson in restraint. Because the loudest reactions aren't always the most powerful. Sometimes, it's the quiet ones that echo the longest. By the time the episode finished airing, the moment had already escaped the studio. It was no longer just a clip from a talk show. It had become a conversation. In living rooms, offices, cafes, and comment sections across the world, people replayed the exchange again and again. Not because of outrage, but because of restraint. Not because of drama, but because of dignity. The question wasn't what Whoopi had asked anymore. It was how Jonathan had answered. For many viewers, something clicked in that moment. They realized they had expected anger, or defensiveness, or at least a sharp comeback. That expectation said more about the world than it did about Jonathan. Because confrontation had become entertainment, and calm had become rare. As clips spread, reactions poured in from all sides. Believers shared the video, saying it was the first time they had seen faith represented without aggression on mainstream television. Skeptics shared it too, not because they suddenly agreed with Jonathan, but because they respected how he handled himself. Even people with no connection to religion commented on the same thing. He didn't try to win. That was the turning point. Jonathan hadn't spoken to convince. He hadn't spoken to convert. He had spoken to clarify who he was. And that distinction changed everything. Back at the studio, the producers reviewed the footage. One of them paused the video at the exact moment Jonathan answered the question about hate. "Look at his face," someone said. "He's not acting." Another nodded. That's why it landed. Whoopi watched the clip later that evening too, alone, without the lights, without the audience. She had asked thousands of difficult questions in her career. She prided herself on challenging people, especially when topics carried power or influence. But this one stayed with her. Not because she felt embarrassed, but because the answer hadn't been what she expected. She had anticipated defense. She had anticipated justification. She had anticipated noise. What she received instead was stillness, and stillness is hard to argue with. Jonathan, meanwhile, went home that night the same way he always did after interviews, quietly. No posts, no statements, no attempts to control the narrative. He sat alone, replaying the moment, not with regret, but with reflection. He knew the question would be dissected. He knew people would take sides. He knew some would twist the story. But he also knew something else. He hadn't compromised himself, and that mattered more than approval. The next morning, messages flooded in. Emails from strangers. Notes from people of different faiths. Messages from those who had walked away from belief long ago. Many said the same thing in different words. "I don't believe what you believe, but I respect how you spoke." That was the shift. The conversation had moved beyond religion. It was now about character. In interviews that followed, journalists tried to bait him again. "Do you think the question was inappropriate? Do you feel attacked?" Should celebrities be challenged more aggressively about faith? Jonathan's answer never changed. Questions are fine, he said. But how we answer them defines us. He refused to criticize Whoopi, refused to play victim, refused to escalate, and in doing so, he removed fuel from the fire. Whoopi eventually addressed the moment again, this time more openly. "We live in a loud world," she said during a later discussion. "And sometimes we forget that listening is also strength." It wasn't an admission of fault, but it was recognition. The public noticed. The clip continued to circulate, not as controversy, but as example. Teachers shared it with students. Parents shared it with children. Leaders shared it in discussions about communication and respect. The turning point wasn't the question. It was the realization that power doesn't always look like dominance. Sometimes it looks like restraint. Jonathan Roumie hadn't just defended himself that day. He had demonstrated something rare on live television. What it looks like to stay grounded when your identity is challenged. What it looks like to respond without resentment. What it looks like to let truth speak without raising its voice. And in a culture addicted to reactions, that became revolutionary. The moment wasn't about Whoopi anymore. It wasn't about Christianity. It wasn't even about television. It was about the quiet strength of knowing who you are and not needing to prove it. That realization lingered. And it prepared the ground for what came next. Because the real impact of that exchange wouldn't be measured in views or headlines. It would be measured in what people took away from it. In the days that followed, the noise slowly faded. No scandals erupted. No public feuds followed. No viral clapbacks were posted. And that alone surprised people. In an age where every tense moment is stretched into outrage, Jonathan Roumie chose stillness. He didn't capitalize on the attention. He didn't tour podcasts to explain himself. He didn't frame the moment as a victory. He simply moved on. But the world didn't. The clip kept circulating, not because it was shocking anymore, but because it was grounding. People returned to it the way they returned to something familiar, something steady. The conversation had resolved itself without a winner or a loser, and that was the resolution. Jonathan returned to work on set shortly after. Same crew, same early mornings, same quiet preparation before filming. When asked about the interview by a cast member, he smiled and said only, "It was a conversation, nothing more, no drama." That answer spoke volumes. On set, people noticed something they hadn't articulated before. Jonathan carried the same presence off camera as he did on it. Calm, focused, unassuming, the kind of consistency that can't be rehearsed. A younger actor finally asked him, "How did you stay so calm?" Jonathan thought for a moment. "Because I wasn't trying to protect an image," he said. "I was trying to be honest." That was the heart of it. Meanwhile, Whoopi Goldberg continued her work as usual. Shows moved on. Topics changed. But the moment lingered in the background, not as controversy but as reflection. During a later episode, she spoke generally, not naming names. "We all get defensive sometimes," she said. "But when someone answers without ego, it forces you to listen." Those who remembered the interview understood exactly what she meant. There was no apology tour, no public reconciliation. None was needed. Respect had quietly replaced tension. Jonathan's approach set a boundary without building a wall. He hadn't submitted, he hadn't attacked. He had simply stood firm in who he was. That was the resolution people felt but couldn't always describe. In the weeks that followed, the impact became clearer. Faith leaders referenced the moment in sermons not to praise Jonathan, but to illustrate restraint. Communication coaches shared the clip as an example of de-escalation. Even skeptics admitted the response had been measured and sincere. The question that once felt sharp now felt small. Because it had been answered fully, without excess. Jonathan eventually addressed the experience in a written interview, months later. "When your beliefs are questioned," he said, "you have a choice. You can react, or you can respond. The other is lasting." That line traveled almost as far as the original clip. The resolution wasn't about vindication. It was about alignment. Jonathan had left the studio aligned with himself, aligned with his values, aligned with his purpose, and that alignment made external validation unnecessary. For viewers, the takeaway wasn't religious. It was human. They saw what happens when someone refuses to be pulled into chaos, when dignity becomes the response, when calm becomes strength. That realization stayed with people longer than any argument ever could. The situation had resolved not because one side surrendered, but because escalation never happened. That's rare, and rarity draws attention. The interview slowly slipped out of the news cycle, but it never disappeared completely. It became one of those moments people referenced quietly, saying, "Remember that time? Remember when someone answered without anger? Remember when a tense question didn't turn into a fight? Remember when respect ended the conversation?" That was the resolution. Not applause, not headlines, not validation, but peace. And peace, in a loud world, is unforgettable. Long after the cameras shut off, long after the applause faded, the moment remained. Not because of what was asked, but because of how it was answered. In a world trained to react instantly, Jonathan Roumie did something quietly radical. He paused, he listened, and he responded without losing himself. That alone made the moment unforgettable. We live in a time where disagreement often turns into disrespect, where questions become accusations, where volume is mistaken for strength, and where winning an argument matters more than understanding another human being. But that day, on live television, something different happened. A man was challenged publicly, not just professionally, but personally. His beliefs were questioned. His integrity was put under a spotlight. And instead of striking back, he chose calm. That choice changed the entire room. Because real power doesn't come from dominating a conversation. It comes from not letting a conversation dominate you. Jonathan didn't try to convince anyone to believe what he believed. He didn't demand agreement. He didn't seek approval. He simply stood in truth, quietly, clearly, without aggression. And that's why people listened. The moral of this moment isn't about religion. It isn't about television. It isn't even about who is right or wrong. It's about character. It's about what happens when someone refuses to trade dignity for applause. When your values are tested, you have two options. You can react from emotion, or you can respond from identity. One creates noise, the other creates impact. Jonathan chose the second, and in doing so, he reminded millions of people of something we often forget. You don't have to shout to be heard. You don't have to attack to be strong. You don't have to win to walk away with respect. Sometimes the calmest voice in the room carries the most weight. That moment resonated because it felt rare, honest, human. People didn't see a celebrity defending an image. They saw a person defending integrity, and integrity speaks a universal language. In the end, no one lost that day. No one was humiliated. No one was silenced. Instead, something better happened. A tense question turned into a moment of reflection. A potential argument turned into mutual respect. And a loud world was reminded that humility still has power. That's the lesson worth carrying forward. Not just on television, but in everyday life. In conversations at work, in disagreements with family, in moments when you're misunderstood, in times when staying calm feels harder than lashing out. Because one day you will be questioned. Your intentions will be doubted. Your character may be challenged. And when that moment comes, remember this. You don't need to prove who you are to someone who's trying to provoke you. You just need to remain who you are. True strength is quiet. True confidence doesn't perform. True faith of any kind doesn't need to fight. It simply stands. If this story reminded you of the power of calm, type Raspati in the comments. If you believe humility is stronger than ego, type StirunGH. And tell us, where are you watching from? Because voices like yours are what keep these conversations meaningful.